Hey everybody, today we're going to be breaking down a sci-fi drama opening credits cue. Let's have a listen.
There was no apocalypse. No sudden collapse. We did this to ourselves. Slowly and painfully. So the hit points of this cue are the opening, the credits, and the cut to black. The cue does continue into the film, but for today's video, I only want to focus on the opening credits. The opening of the film starts with our character hyperventilating. The viewers don't know why yet, but that will be made clear later in the film. However, one of the reasons I can go ahead and talk about is the oppressive heat featured in the film. In the world of this story, climate change has become so extreme that the earth is so hot it's hard for humans to breathe and regulate their own body temperature. This cue is also the moment we get introduced to the main character, Bryn. The second hit point is the opening credits, and that builds into the reveal of the title. And lastly, the film cuts to black and the movie begins. The theory of this cue is very straightforward. I came up with a chord progression, and that progression is Bryn's theme. Bryn is an engineer, and she's always using her skills to problem solve the issues the characters run into. She is very straightforward and logical. To represent that in this character's theme, I created rhythms that are very straightforward. I think that with modern style cues, especially of this nature, the motifs and themes come from sound design rather than melodic lines. I like writing melodies on other works I do, but for this score, the story called for this type of cue. So let's go back to the opening. The first thing the audience will hear music-wise is what I call the land of tomorrow synth. This synth represents the oppressive heat in the world of the story. In my mind, brightness and distortion sound like heat, so naturally creating synthesizer sounds that utilize these characteristics were my first thought. Now let's get into the actual instrumentation. We'll start with the Land of Tomorrow synth, which represents the heat. Here's what the synthesizer setup looks like. I'm using a completely wet reverb sound to add some more space and distance for the synth. I'm using LFOs to add movement to the wavetable position, and I'm spreading out the pitch to add some layers and depth to the sound. I'm using 3 unison voices and distortion. I am automating the channel EQ to add some movement to the synth. The low ambience is just a preset I made from years ago on another album that I tweaked and repurposed for some lower texture. Lastly, I have the static texture. This is just a static type sound I'm using and panning it around the mix to add some more layers and sound design. Together those sound like this. Moving into the main synthesizers, I want to start with the chord pluck synth. This is the main synth for the score. I'm using a macro control to adjust the cutoff, the low pass filter, the decay, release, and distortion. This control allows me to add dynamics to the sound so I can crescendo and so on. I'm also using the random macro control on some pitch adjustments, the distortion dry wet signal, noise, and pulse width to add some randomness to the sound to emulate an analog synthesizer. And finally, I'm using the velocity macro to allow me to accent certain rhythmic patterns via MIDI velocity. I am using 4 unison voices on this synth to add more layers and dimension. The other 2 main synthesizers are what I am calling the ARP synth and the bass pluck synth. These 2 are slight variations of the chord pluck synth. I made a copy and did some tweaking to give it a difference in sound. The ARP synth is used mostly for doing arpeggios and adding movement to the cue, and the bass pluck synth is used for the bass. The sub bass pluck is a mono synth I am using for the low end of the bass pluck to avoid any phasing issues. I wanted the sub bass to be solid and punchy, so I need to make it its own track and remove the additional voicings and modulation. Together, these synthesizers make up the heart of Bryn's theme. Looking at the strings, I'm using East-West Hollywood strings long. I wanted big, lush string sections, and I think East-West does that well. They are starting in a tight voicing and expanding outward as the cue builds. They are always rising in pitch until they cut to black. The last part of this cue is the percussion. I tried to make the percussion elements sound synthetic to blend with the synths better by adding lo-fi effects and distortion to some of the sounds. I'm using Damage Metal Menu 1 to add some texture to the top end of the mix when the music is full. I'm using the lo-fi effect to add a digital sound to the instrument. For the drums, I have them broken up into 2 tracks. The sub-hit is a deep bass drum sound, and that is the big organo kit. The top end of the drums are there to add clarity and texture, and that is the studio concert bass drum with the punish effect on. I'm also modulating the pitch so it drops at the end of the hit. I did this so that it won't ring out over the rest of the mix, and on top of that, I thought it just sounded pretty neat, and it adds a little bit more of a synthetic sound to the drums. The last bit of percussion is the 16 pulse pattern preset I made in Massive. It is just panning around the mix, and I have a macro to adjust the cutoff. As far as mixing goes, this cue as of now is actually not mixed. This is just the demo. However, I am using some temporary effects until the mixing stage begins. I'm using a lexicon emulation from Eastwest Spaces II, and that is the Digital Hollywood Hall 5.2. I'm using a simple stereo delay to add some movement and texture to some of the synth tracks. I'm using the Southern California Hall strings preset for the strings, and I'm using the percussion preset for the synths, ambience, and percussion. I'm also using my own flavor of an exciter tube saturation from Ozone 8 on both the ambience and the synth bus to add some more grit and an analog feel to the sounds. I do have some presets I created in Ozone 8 that I like to use to add some grit and saturation to the samples. I'm using the vintage tape saturation. I'm also using an exciter with the analog preset just to add some noise into the samples. And lastly, I'm using an imager just to give the mix a little bit more space. Massive isn't really a synth I hear much about in the film music community, but I think it has some great value and endless creative options for designing sounds and coming up with unique and original instruments for a score. I have researched so much on using Massive, and I feel like I'm not even close to fully understanding the synth. I have read some criticism that Massive does sound digital and cold, but I do think there are plenty of options for warming it up. I think when writing a modern cue, sound design is just as important and sometimes more important than a strong tune. Again, this isn't to say that tunesmithing should be overlooked, but I think the story will dictate what the music needs. In the past few years, maybe even decades of film score trends, it seems an emphasis on atonal underscore and sound design are becoming very popular in film soundtracks. And in my opinion, I think being able to write both a great tune and creating unique sounds are two skill sets that are just as important for a modern film composer and something I'm trying to consistently improve upon. If you enjoyed this video, a like would be very much appreciated. If you have any ideas for any cues or genres of music you'd like me to write, let me know in the comments down below. If you want to see more content like this, make sure you subscribe. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.
There was no apocalypse. No sudden collapse. We did this to ourselves. Slowly and painfully.